Okay, folks, welcome to Chapter 10, Global Stratification. Now, again, I wanted to cover the chapter on the economy prior to getting into this chapter on global stratification. And just keep in mind that also in this chapter we're covering stratification and inequality. So much of the terminology that we covered since spring break is applicable when we start talking about global inequality. But what you'll find out is that we're largely going to focus on the importance of economic variables as it relates to global stratification and global inequality. And so, having said that, let's just jump right into things. This should look familiar to you. We just finished covering this in the chapter previous, where we talk about different types of economic activity, again, the primary sector, secondary, and tertiary sector. So I just wanted to kind of bridge that last chapter to the last chapter that you covered to this chapter. So we're going to look at some pie charts. Now, you might recall that we did this, and I'm just going to jump to the most recent one that's in your textbook, and this is on page 285. You recall back in the chapter, I can't even remember what number it was now, but the chapter on right after spring break, I think it was chapter 9 on social stratification and inequality, where we introduced the terminology of stratification and inequality, and we also I'm sorry, I just had a message pop up on the screen. I was trying to read it, but we also covered economics and social class and those kinds of things. And part of what we looked at, income and wealth, that's what I was trying to remember. But what we looked at were pie charts, and we looked at the distribution of income and wealth in the United States. And these pie charts might look similar because we're looking at global inequality associated with income and global inequality associated with wealth. So it's income and wealth, but looking at the global level. And you can see at the very bottom of the slide, it's broken out in quintiles again by 20% marks. And you can see that basically the richest of the world's population accounts for most of the income and almost all of the wealth, right? So we're going to look at these different dimensions, and part of what we want to do is to think about, well, what countries are high income countries, what are middle income countries, and what are low income countries. And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. I'm actually going to give you a question for you to elaborate on in your lecture notes. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about development, okay? So something we've not really talked about in great detail, certainly not since spring break, and we may have talked about this a little bit prior to spring break, is thinking about human development, right? What does it mean to develop? I think we talked in class at one point about what will it mean? How do you define success? And I do remember us talking about that. What does success mean? And we talked about educational attainment, about having a career. We talked about making enough money to sustain yourself and a family. And those were a lot of the feedback that students gave in that class when we talked about that. That was probably around the chapter on socialization, where we talked about the process of human development and learning culture and those kinds of things. Here, where we talk about development, we're talking about societal development. And, you start to ask the question, well, how have we developed over time and as a human society? And then you start looking at, sociocultural evolution, where we think about hunters and gatherers, horticultural and pastoral societies, and and agricultural societies. And, you know, one of the things that you want to think about is why did we develop the way that we did as a human civilization? And, you know, then a part of that question also is, this is not a question for you to elaborate on in your lecture notes just yet, but just something for you to think about. But what does social development look like? We have an idea about what human development is. What does it mean to grow as a person? And, you know, a lot of that is defined in culture as well. But what do we mean to grow as a society? And what kinds of things influence that growth? And certainly the economy, as we've, you know, traced back in the last chapter, the economy really is a driver of social and cultural development, for better or for worse, right? And that gets us to this slide right here. You probably have heard of first world countries and third world countries. That used to be some terminology used by the global development community as a way of saying, okay, what does it mean to develop as a society, and how can the global community promote development? So I'm going to pose a couple of questions here. Again, these are just something for you to think about right now, but why would we be interested in development? Right? And I'm going to give you two reasons why. Why would you and I be interested in global development? And what I mean by that is people living in Bangladesh, people living in Bolivia, people living in South Africa, all over the world. Why would you and I be concerned about cultural, societal, economic development? And I'm going to give you two reasons why. First, because it's the right thing to be concerned about. To be concerned about humans all over the world. There's a moral implication of being concerned. I think it's safe to say that most people would like people in the world not to starve, that would like a situation in the world where people had clean water, that had the opportunity of work to be able to sustain themselves and their communities. So there's a moral implication of development, okay? And that may be enough as to why development matters, because people matter, okay? The second question maybe is a little bit more selfish. How does the development status or lack of development status of people in another country affect me? And that's something we're going to explore a little bit in this chapter when we start looking at how is it that the United States is wealthy and rich, for example. Well, part of the reason why we're rich is because we take advantage of countries that are poor countries. Okay, I mean, that's part of the equation here. Also, don't we want as many people involved in the global economy as possible? You know, when people are not involved in the global economy, not only does it affect them and their livelihood and their well-being and their health, for example, but it also doesn't contribute to the global economy. So let me elaborate on that a little bit further. You know, there are a lot of poor people that are not integrated in the educational system or the global workforce in India and in China, millions and millions of people. And so perhaps, for example, the creativity, the innovation that we need to solve global pandemics, the research skills, the math skills, the science, what people contribute to the flourishing of human culture. You know, there's moral and ethical reasons why we're concerned about development. And there's also perhaps more of a self-interest kind of a thing. I benefit if other people are engaged in the economy, and, you know, perhaps they benefit from me, okay? So we're going to get to that notion as well about what is good development, right? And that gets us back to this slide. We adopted a model, actually gets to the next slide, but before we get to the next slide, we've adopted a model that moved away from this terminology that's focused on industrialization. And let me explain to you why. So when you think about sociocultural evolution to hunters and gatherers, agricultural societies, industrial societies, post-industrial societies, that suggests to you that all human civilization, all societies are going to pass through those stages. And that's not exactly accurate. And here's a big reason why that's not going to happen. Environmental damage, okay? So that industrialization model, notice that the first world, second world, third world focuses on those that are industrialized nations. Well, industrialization may have benefited a segment of human society, which in turn may have benefited the world at large. And I think we can say that. But there's a byproduct of industrialization that has wreaked havoc on the environment. You know, industrialization is built upon fossil fuels and the use of gas and oil and coal. We can't have all societies on the planet progressing through or walking through that industrialization model, because fossil fuels are not infinite, they're finite, right? So if every country on the planet were to use fossil fuels, we would run out almost immediately, right? So there's not enough fuel sources. And also, if we burn all of the natural resources we have, what is that going to do to the environment? Well, with just the small amount of industrialization on the planet that we have right now, we know what that has caused in terms of environmental damage, environmental issues, pollution, damages to the ozone layer, to the ecosystem in general. So we've had to move away from that model. We have to move away from industrialization because the planet, ecologically, the planet can't sustain industrialization all over the world, okay? Now there's another dimension of this that's going to be relevant in the next chapter, and that's population. And so again, all of these chapters build on one another, and I think you're going to see how this relates to what we recently talked about and how this chapter is going to relate to the next chapter. So let's move on to the next slide. So that new model we've adopted is high income, middle income, and low income countries, okay? Which countries are considered high income, which countries are considered middle income, and which countries are considered low income countries. And this is where I'm going to give you a question or some subject matter for you to elaborate on in your notes, much like an assignment, okay? And here is the question. What regions of the world are high, middle, and low-income regions? What regions of the world? That's in your textbook, okay? And we're going to cover some of that in the coming slides here, but that's the first question. What regions of the world are high? In what regions of the world do high-income countries reside? In what regions of the world do middle-income countries reside? And in what regions of the world do low-income countries reside? So that's the first part of this. The second part of this, what is it that makes the difference between high, middle, and low-income countries? How are they similar? How are they different? Now, I'm going to talk about this right now, but I want you to elaborate on these two questions, two subject areas that I just posed to you. I want you to elaborate on this in your lecture notes. So again, you have your lecture notes, and then I want you to thoroughly answer these questions as part of your lecture notes, okay? The questions I just posed to you. So let's look at this a little bit further. So again, some of what I'm going to cover right now is going to answer those questions, but yeah, so again, I want you to elaborate on this. High-income countries are largely in the northern hemisphere. Look at that first bullet point there. 47% of the Earth's land area, only 23% of the world's people, okay? So about half of the land area and about a quarter of all the people in the world. So you start to realize that most people in the world live in a middle or low-income country. Most people in the world are on that borderline of poverty, and we're going to talk about what type of poverty here in just a little bit. Notice here, this bullet point down here, production is capital intensive, leading to service-oriented work. Now, what we mean by capital intensive is the use of a lot of resources or having at your access money and resources to be productive, right? And so this is a really critical point as to why high, middle, and low income countries are different. So in the United States, we use a lot of technology to help us be productive. Remember the gross domestic product, total goods and services that a country produces? I mean, that is the backbone of our economy. And economies all over the world are quite similar, except, what makes them different, and production is what makes them different largely, okay? We are very, very productive, okay, because we use technology so much. And this is going to be an important point to think as to, again, not only is production a reason why there's varying levels of development and poverty around the world, but also varying levels of technology, okay? These are where those areas are located. And again, this is in your book, and I do want you to elaborate on this in your lecture notes. Middle income countries, industrial jobs, that secondary sector, are more common. Now, what's interesting about middle income countries is that you'll have examples. You're going to watch a couple of videos on this after this in the next two assignments, but middle income countries have very developed areas, and middle income countries also have really, really poor areas. So you kind of got a 50-50 split. So you got to be careful as you think about middle income countries. It doesn't mean that they're almost high income. It means that they have both worlds, so to speak. They have some elements of high income countries and some elements of low income countries, okay? Notice here that the people that live in the rural areas lack access to schools, to medical care, to adequate housing. This is why when a pandemic hits, middle income societies and low income societies are really the most vulnerable, because they don't have the type of medical care, health care system that more developed countries have. And so more people die as a result of that. 35% of the world's land area and home to 60% of humanity. So you could think that most people in the world are living in a middle income society. Where are those places? That's in your textbook, okay? China and India are two of the biggest. Okay. Next slide here. Low-income countries, they are very agricultural. A small percent of the world's land area and a small percent of the world's population. Now, what we're talking about low-income countries, again, is a level of poverty that is approaching concepts such as famine. People starving to death, people not having enough water, people don't live very long, people don't have, again, enough food to eat, poor medical care. Okay, people's lives are shaped by hunger, disease, and unsafe housing, okay? So 17% of the world's population. So we had 60% of the world's population living in a middle-income society. So over 75% of the world's population is living in a middle or low-income society. Over 75% of the world's population is not living in a place like the United States. So you think about that, right? So, a majority of people are living in poverty. And again, this is a different kind of poverty than what we see in the United States. Now then, I'm going to bring in a dimension of population, and we're going to elaborate on this more in the next chapter, but some interesting points to note here. Again, we have high, middle, and low-income countries, all right? And the income is in purple. You can see the pattern here, more income in high-income countries and much less in low-income countries. But look at the population in green, right? So this is where most of the population is. This is what global inequality looks like. It's right there on that screen, okay? So people in high-income countries have access to much more money, much more wealth as a result of having access to money. And you've got people in middle and low-income societies that struggle with what they have access to, okay? This is a more updated chart compared to the previous slide, but same dynamic going on here. It's actually increased in terms of the money. in high-income society. Okay, so the difference is, so when we think about, and this takes you back to the chapter on social stratification that we covered after spring break. We talked about, again, the breakout per 20% population, breakout of income and the breakout of wealth. And you might remember when we looked at the wealth pie chart, there was 20% of the U.S. population had negative wealth. And we talked about that being debt, right? And that is certainly an indicator of poverty. Part of also what we discussed in the chapter on social stratification and inequality was looking at this idea that wherever you have human civilization, you're going to have people that are poor. So, inequality is universal. So anywhere you have people living together, you're going to have inequality, meaning you're going to have some that have more resources than others. You're going to have some that have fewer resources than others, okay? That's a dimension of human societies. That really is a fundamental philosophical question that we have in the field of sociology, okay? And I think I mentioned that back in the chapter on social stratification and inequality. So relative poverty, that's what that is, right? Depending on the culture where you are, you're going to have people that have they're going to have resources that are lower relative to everybody else. So relative poverty is subjective, right? So depending on how a society measures inequality or how you get power in a society, some people are going to have more, some people are going to have less. That's relative poverty, okay? Absolute poverty is something very different. Absolute poverty is focused squarely on a lack of resources that is life-threatening. Again, this is starvation kinds of stuff. People that don't have the basic resources for survival, okay? All right, moving on then. So this is the question that we're going to pose. Why does global poverty exist? I mentioned technology, okay? Something else that we kind of mentioned, but I'm going to elaborate on more in the next chapter is population growth. Poorest countries have the highest birth rates, and we'll talk about what that means again in the next chapter. Population growth is growing the most in poor places, okay? They also have high death rates. So that's an interesting dynamic, and we'll look at that compared to the United States, for example, in the next chapter. Cultural patterns. One reason why poor societies are so poor is because, they've done things a certain way for a good chunk of human history, right? So some of the poorest places on the planet are in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. Well, that's where humans date back to, right? Some of the first communities growing up out of the agricultural revolution, first societies are in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. So, they've made it this far. Why would they change now? And this helps us to begin to think a little bit about this notion of cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. And here's the point about that. Ethnocentrism, again, judging another culture by the standards of your own. So, let's pose a question here just for something for us to think about. Who are we to say that our way of life is the best? I mean, look, I'm American. I'm as, tied and committed to that ideal just as much as anybody else, right? But we haven't been around very long. Are we mature enough to say that there's some things that we do that are not that good? And there's some things that we do that are really good. Can we look at other societies and say, well, they do some things good and maybe some other things not so good? This also gets us back to the question of development. What is development? What is good development? Okay? Is it an economy that is the best economy in the world? Or is development where everybody has access to health care and everybody has a better quality of life? Everybody's happiness in society an indicator of development? That's a question that is posed by some research organizations around the world, measuring happiness, and that maybe should be an indicator of development. Okay, so but back to this idea about global poverty. Another big reason why there's global poverty is gender inequality. And this is an interesting dynamic, an interesting demographic characteristic. I'll talk about demography in the next chapter, but basically what we're talking about here with gender is that you can look at any society and you can say, all right, what is the role of women in that society? If women are birthing a lot of kids and staying at home, they're usually are lower income societies. The more that we get women integrated into the workforce, integrated into positions of authority and power, then that becomes a market indicator, a quite obvious reason as to why a country is more developed. You can't have half the population not integrated in the economy and expect to be a developed society. Whereas development is income status, high income, middle income, or low income. Okay. And the last item as to why global poverty exists. Again, you'll note here there's, 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 bullet points here. So global poverty is not an easy thing to solve. There have been initiatives, in the last 100 years or so to try to address poverty in other places, but it's not an easy thing to solve. If it were easy to solve, we wouldn't have global poverty, right? But the last item on here that I want to talk about a little bit more, the other items that you see up there, the technology down through gender inequality, we're going to talk about that a little bit more next chapter, okay? But to finish this chapter off, we're going to focus on global power relationships, right? The process by which some nations enrich themselves through political and economic control of other nations. Global exploitation allows some nations to develop economically at the expense of others. Well, you think about North America, right? The United States. A big chunk of the United States used to be Mexico, right? A big reason why the United States was able to get wealthy is that we brought people from Africa in the form of slaves to this country. We've done the same thing with bringing people from China and Mexico as laborers when it's, good for us to do so. So this gets into conflict theory, okay? So just make a note about that. And you're going to have an assignment on, let me check something real quick. I made some notes for myself. You're going to have an assignment on the different theories of global poverty. You're going to have an assignment after this lecture. So here's colonialism, an example of this. One of the videos that you're going to be watching as part of this is going to be looking at the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And you're going to notice that people in that video talk English and French. Well, it's an interesting question. Why would people in Africa talk French or speak French? Well, it's got to do with the colonial relationship of France with that part of Africa. Why do people in North America largely speak English? Because we were English colonies starting out. Why do people in Mexico speak Spanish? Because of the colonial influence of Spain. Yeah, these may be things that we kind of take for granted, okay? But there's a newer colonialism that is well beyond the role of nations in other nations. The neocolonialism focuses on the role of what we call multinational corporations, what their role is in terms of promoting income and profit and the different elements of the global economy. And the neocolonialism is where big companies, big corporations take advantage of poorer places for labor in order to, benefit those that are wealthy. Okay, so you're gonna watch a couple videos about this coming up here after this lecture. Okay, so generally going to stop right there.